August 19, 1944. Deep within the fortified bunkers of Wehrmacht headquarters in East Prussia, a chilling assessment echoed through the war rooms. The air was thick with a grim satisfaction, as the German High Command, seasoned veterans of Blitzkrieg and the unforgiving vastness of the Eastern Front, meticulously analyzed the Allied push across France. General Alfred Yold, chief of the operations staff of the OKW, leaned over maps emblazoned with the audacious arrows of General George S. Patton's Third Army, his gaze betraying a cynical amusement. He proclaimed with unshakable conviction that Patton's furious advance, though impressive, was inherently unsustainable. Patton will halt within days, perhaps hours, Yold asserted. No army can sustain such advanced speeds without fuel, without ammunition, without the very sinews of war. This wasn't mere wishful thinking. It was a judgment rooted in the hard-learned lessons of their own military doctrine. The Germans, masters of rapid offensive warfare, understood intimately the brutal arithmetic of logistics. They had witnessed the initial dazzling successes of their own blitzkrieg in Poland and France, only to see its momentum bleed away as supply lines strained and broke. They had experienced firsthand the catastrophic consequences in the Soviet Union, where vast distances and an unforgiving landscape had choked their armored spearheads, ultimately contributing to their undoing. Their own meticulously planned supply chains, though efficient, were inherently fragile, demanding precise timing and limited overextension. Therefore, to the German generals, the American logistical effort was a joke, a chaotic improvisation destined for spectacular failure. They confidently predicted that the sheer volume of supplies required to fuel such a breakneck pace would overwhelm any logistical system. They pictured roads choked with stalled trucks, depots empty, and tanks running on fumes. The American industrial might, while acknowledged, was seen as irrelevant if it couldn't be delivered to the front. From their perspective, the logistical constraints of war were immutable laws, and the Americans, in their naive exuberance, were about to crash headfirst into them. This was not a question of if, but when. This fatal miscalculation, born of their own experiences and their underestimation of American ingenuity, would soon be answered not by the laws of German warfare, but by an unprecedented, audacious feat of logistics that would stun the world. While German High Command confidently dismissed American logistical prowess, convinced of Patton's inevitable halt, the reality on the Western Front was indeed teetering on a knife's edge for the Allies. General George S. Patton, Jr., a figure of unyielding aggression and strategic brilliance, had unleashed his Third Army across France with a ferocity that caught the Germans entirely off guard. His tanks, their engines roaring, had swept through Brittany, liberated towns and cities, and were now poised on the very doorstep of Germany. The speed was exhilarating, a triumph of maneuver warfare that had driven the Wehrmacht reeling eastward. But this blinding pace, this very success, was creating a paradox. Each mile gained, each enemy unit bypassed, stretched the Allied supply lines thinner and thinner, like a rubber band pulled to its absolute breaking point. The strategic ports of Normandy, critical arteries for incoming materiel, were now hundreds of miles behind the rapidly advancing front. And the infrastructure that would normally bridge this chasm, the intricate network of French railways and bridges, lay in ruins, systematically destroyed by retreating German forces or inadvertently crippled by Allied bombing.
Consider the sheer scale of the demand. An American infantry division required approximately 600 tons of supplies every single day to maintain combat effectiveness. A fully mechanized armored division needed far more, closer to 1,000 tons. Multiply that by dozens of divisions spread across a rapidly expanding front, and the numbers became astronomical. Fuel, above all else, was the critical bottleneck. Tanks, trucks, reconnaissance vehicles, artillery prime movers, even the vital fighter bombers providing close air support, all were insatiable consumers of gasoline. Without it, the spearhead of the Allied advance would grind to a halt, leaving thousands of men and machines exposed and vulnerable to a revitalized enemy. Traditional supply methods designed for a more static war were utterly overwhelmed. The few operational rail lines were choked, lacking locomotives and rolling stock, their repair a monumental, time-consuming task. Conventional trucking units, though valiant, were simply too few and too dispersed to cope with the unprecedented volume and distance. Roads, already strained by military traffic, were crumbling under the weight. Each passing hour brought the Third Army closer to immobility, a sitting target for a desperate German counterattack. The vibrant, unstoppable momentum of the liberation was flickering, threatening to die out. Commanders on the ground, from the lowest platoon leader to General Eisenhower himself, recognized the dire predicament. The advance was not merely slowing, it was on the precipice of collapse, threatening to turn triumph into catastrophe. A radical, audacious solution was not just desired, it was absolutely essential. The very fate of the Western Front, perhaps even the entire war, hinged on an answer to this logistical nightmare. An answer that would defy conventional wisdom and rewrite the rules of modern warfare. The Allied advance, a breathtaking surge across France, now teetered on the brink of collapse, not from fierce enemy resistance, but from the unbearable strain on its own supply lines. Patton's tanks, once a symbol of relentless momentum, were slowing, their thirsty engines demanding fuel that simply couldn't reach them fast enough. Every road was a tangled mess of two-way traffic, empty trucks fighting their way back past loaded ones, creating bottlenecks that choked the very lifeblood of the war effort. The sheer scale of the logistical nightmare threatened to undo all the gains of the Normandy breakout. But amidst this growing despair, a singular vision began to coalesce in the mind of Lieutenant Colonel Frank Ayres. A pragmatic and innovative logistics officer, Ayres was intimately familiar with the chaos, and he knew that traditional solutions simply wouldn't suffice. He recognized that the very speed of the advance demanded an equally radical approach to supply, one that defied conventional military wisdom. Ayres envisioned a system so audacious, so utterly unprecedented in military history, it seemed almost impossible. He proposed a dedicated, high-speed, one-way trucking network, a colossal conveyor belt of supplies stretching from the ports of Normandy directly to the front lines. This was the genesis of the Red Ball Express. The name itself was borrowed from American rail terminology, signifying priority freight, and Ayres's plan imbued it with a new, urgent meaning. Roads would be designated as one-way arteries, marked with large, distinctive red circles to guide the thousands of drivers, eliminating head-on traffic and maximizing throughput. Trucks would run day and night, headlamps ablaze even in blackout conditions, pushing through the darkness and the dust with a singular purpose. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a complete reimagining of military logistics, an industrial-scale solution designed to break the supply bottleneck and keep Patton's blitzkrieg fueled no matter the cost. But the audacity of the Red Ball Express wasn't merely in its unprecedented scale or its radical departure from conventional military logistics. Its true revolutionary spirit, and indeed its most profound human story, lay in the very hands that gripped the steering wheels. While the planners meticulously charted routes and allocated resources, the question remained, who would transform this logistical blueprint into a living, breathing artery of war?
The answer, often overlooked in the grand narratives of the war, was a testament to both the systemic injustices of the era and the indomitable spirit of those who defied them. Out of the tens of thousands of drivers who would eventually fuel Patton's advance, a staggering 75% were African American soldiers. These were men who, in a still segregated U.S. Army, had largely been relegated to service and support roles. Cooks, laundrymen, stevedores, laborers, far from the glory of the front lines, often dismissed and denied opportunities based on the color of their skin. Yet, as the relentless demands of the European theater escalated and the very survival of the Allied offensive hung in the balance, these forgotten soldiers found themselves thrust into the crucible of combat logistics. This wasn't the combat they had been trained for, perhaps not the combat they had even dreamed of, but it was combat nonetheless. Every mile driven was a defiance, every supply delivered a victory. For many, it represented a double-edged sword, a sudden, critical role that offered a chance to prove their courage and competence on a scale previously unimaginable, but also one that exposed them to the same brutal dangers as any frontline soldier, often without the recognition or respect afforded to their white counterparts. They were the engine of the Red Ball,
not just moving supplies, but carrying the weight of expectation and the silent hope that their valor and sacrifice would, in some small way, chip away at the walls of prejudice back home. Their commitment to this vital, dangerous work transformed a logistical necessity into a profound act of service and defiance, forever etching their names into the true story of the Red Ball Express. The decree to launch the Red Ball Express was given on August 25, 1944. What followed was a logistical miracle, a frantic scramble against the clock that would defy every tenet of conventional military wisdom and leave the seasoned German High Command utterly bewildered. In just 36 frantic hours, a sprawling, unprecedented supply network was conjured into existence from sheer will and industrial might. This wasn't merely an organizational feat. It was a testament to American improvisation, audacity, and a profound, almost reckless faith in their own capabilities. Imagine the chaos, the sheer bedlam of those initial hours. Military police fanned out, commandeering roads across northern France, transforming them into a meticulous one-way highway system. Two main arteries, Route North and Route South, were designated exclusively for Red Ball traffic. No exceptions, no deviations. Along these vital lifelines, impromptu depots sprang up, like desert oases for weary convoys. These weren't just fuel stops. They were makeshift maintenance bays, rest areas, and forward supply points, manned by legions of dedicated support personnel. Thousands upon thousands of the venerable GMC CCKW 2.5-ton trucks, the workhorse deuce and a half of the American Army, were pressed into service. These humble vehicles, designed for durability, not speed, would become the beating heart of Patton's relentless advance. But trucks alone were not enough. They needed drivers, and in an army still grappling with deeply entrenched racial segregation, it was largely the unheralded African-American soldiers of the Quartermaster Corps who stepped forward. These men, often relegated to support roles and denied the glory of frontline combat, were now handed the most dangerous, most critical mission on the Western Front. They were expected to drive, often for 20 hours a day, through enemy-held territory under constant threat of ambush, fatigue, and the sheer mental strain of operating at breakneck pace.
The task, by any objective measure, impossible. No army in history had ever attempted to sustain such a forward surge with a temporary ad hoc trucking system of this magnitude. German strategists, steeped in the meticulous planning of the Blitzkrieg and the harsh lessons of overextended supply lines in Russia, simply couldn't conceive of it. Their military doctrine preached caution, consolidation, and the establishment of robust, permanent infrastructure before any significant advance. America, it seemed, was rewriting the rules of war not with grand strategy, but with grit, gasoline, and an almost unbelievable capacity for immediate, massive-scale implementation. And in those 36 hours, the Red Ball Express was born, a rolling defiance of every logical objection. But what did that defiance look like on the ground? What was the grim reality for the thousands of young men, predominantly African-American, who climbed into the cabs of those GMC 2.5-ton trucks each day? This wasn't a static front or a comfortable base. This was the unforgiving, relentless daily grind of the Red Ball Express. From the moment the sun edged above the horizon, or more often, long before it, the drivers were already battling the elements, the clock, and the looming threat of the enemy. Their shifts stretched to 12, 18, even 20 hours, a brutal cycle of endless driving, snatched moments of sleep, and the constant thrum of engines in their ears. The roads themselves were a treacherous labyrinth, hastily repaired, pockmarked by shellfire, often dissolving into a quagmire of mud or choked by dust depending on the weather. These were no superhighways, but narrow, winding paths through liberated French towns, dense forests, and open fields, where a single wrong turn could mean disaster. And danger wasn't just in the terrain. German strafing runs from opportunistic Luftwaffe pilots were a constant, terrifying possibility, their machine guns ripping through the thin canvas tops of the trucks. Artillery shells, sometimes from retreating German units, other times from misdirected Allied fire, could turn a stretch of road into an inferno in an instant. Ambushes by scattered German forces or even saboteurs became a grim part of the job description. Every truck, a vital artery in Patton's advance, was also a ticking clock of potential mechanical failure. Tires blew, engine seized, axles snapped under the strain of continuous overloading and punishing speeds. Yet there was no time for lengthy repairs. Ingenuity became a daily necessity. Drivers and their assistants learned to strip down carburetors by flashlight in the dead of night, jerry-rig broken parts with scavenged materials, or swap out entire engines by the side of the road with the precision of a NASCAR pit crew. They pushed their vehicles and themselves far beyond any reasonable limit. The pressure to deliver was immense. Every gallon of gas, every crate of ammunition, every medical supply was literally the difference between a stalled offensive and a rapid breakthrough, between life and death on the front lines.
Out of this crucible of chaos and constant threat, a unique culture blossomed. These men, largely segregated from white combat units and often denied the same respect, forged an unbreakable camaraderie. They called themselves Red Ballers, a badge of honor worn with defiant pride. They developed their own slang, their own songs, their own ways of coping with the unimaginable stress. Jokes were traded, stories shared, and a deep, unspoken bond formed between those who shared the same endless roads, the same gnawing fear, and the same fierce determination to prove their worth. Their resilience wasn't just about enduring the physical hardships. It was a profound assertion of their humanity and their invaluable contribution to the war effort, defying both the enemy on the road and the systemic prejudice that shadowed their heroic endeavors. While African American soldiers were turning the impossible into reality on dusty and dangerous roads, an alarming stream of information began flowing into Wehrmacht command posts on the Western Front. The initial intelligence reports were mere fragments, scattered and often dismissed by German staff officers as exaggerations or mistakes. Frontline scouts, low-flying Luftwaffe pilots, and anti-aircraft units taken prisoner all spoke of strange things. Massive, seemingly endless convoys of trucks moving relentlessly day and night. These reports painted a picture utterly alien to German military doctrine. They described thousands of trucks, not armored vehicles or combat equipment, but ordinary transport trucks, stretching for kilometers, strung out like a river of steel. The most baffling aspect was their operation, continuous, unceasing, and seemingly unaffected by darkness or threats from German forces. German officers, trained in a system that prized precision, tactical speed in combat, and reliance on railroads for large-scale logistics, simply could not make sense of it. How could an army advancing so rapidly sustain such a supply line using only trucks? It defied everything they had been taught about the limits of military logistics. German generals had confidently believed that the American army, despite its industrial might, would face insurmountable logistical challenges as it stretched its supply lines then. They had anticipated a stall, a point where frontline forces would run out of fuel and ammunition, giving the Wehrmacht time to regroup and counterattack. But what was being reported was something entirely different. It was not a supply line in the conventional sense, but a continuous flow of material, an unofficial but extraordinarily efficient highway. More detailed reports began to describe one-way roads, strict operating rules adhered to by American drivers, and astonishing average speeds maintained by these convoys. German generals began to feel a deep unease. They had miscalculated. They had underestimated not only America's combat capabilities, but also its ability to mass-produce war. This was not sophisticated tactics, it was raw industrial power applied to the front with an efficiency they had never witnessed. They could not comprehend how a nation could mobilize such vast resources and manpower just to move goods, while for them, every gallon of fuel, every bullet was a precious asset to be carefully rationed. The bewilderment gradually turned to anxiety as these non-military convoys began redrawing the strategic map of the Western Front. While German generals puzzled over the unbelievable intelligence reports, the relentless truck convoys continued roaring through France. But even the most extraordinary logistical machine could not escape the harsh law of attrition in war. Gravel roads, muddy terrain, and the ceaseless weight of cargo were ruthlessly destroying the GMC CKW 2.5-ton trucks. A single truck could travel hundreds of miles a day for weeks on end, its engine roaring, brakes screeching, tires worn bald. By all accounts, this should have led to collapse. But what Jodl and his colleagues could not foresee was the boundless ingenuity of the Americans, a blend of practical skill and audacity. Ingenuity and resilience became the daily operating principle of the Red Ball Express. When a truck broke down on the road, it was not simply abandoned. Mobile repair teams, often consisting of experienced African-American mechanics and engineers, rushed to the scene at breakneck speed, performing extraordinary roadside fixes. They patched burst tires in minutes, repaired broken suspensions using parts scavenged from scrapped trucks, or even replaced entire engines in under 2 hours, a feat of industrial wizardry where just transporting the replacement engine was a major challenge in itself. This was not factory-style maintenance. It was battlefield triage under pressure, amid dust and chaos. Moreover, when main routes became congested by convoys stretching for miles, damaged by enemy shelling, or simply overwhelmed, American logistics officers quickly established alternate paths, often winding rural roads or improvised trails. They were not just moving goods, they were relocating their entire logistics network, adapting to shifting terrain and battlefield conditions hour by hour. This flexibility was completely beyond the comprehension of German command, bound as they were by rigid procedures and scarce replacements. For them, logistics was a precise science, meticulously planned. For the Americans, it was an art of improvisation, a ceaseless dance between destruction and innovation, where every emerging problem became an opportunity to demonstrate even greater ingenuity. With every mile Patton advanced eastward, the demand for fuel grew exponentially, threatening to turn his armored core into useless steel hulks. But if the Red Ball Express was the blood nourishing the front lines, then another bold logistical solution became the unceasing aorta, Operation Pluto. This was an almost unbelievable feat of engineering, a network of undersea fuel pipelines secretly deployed from England across the English Channel and into France. Developed by British engineers, these Pluto pipelines, with diameters large enough to pump thousands of gallons of gasoline per hour, created a continuous, near-limitless supply of fuel. It was the perfect complement, bypassing all-terrain obstacles and enemy sabotage, delivering fuel directly to depots near the front. Combined with the Red Ball Express, a two-tiered system was established, pipelines pumping raw fuel and trucks distributing it to every tank and jeep gasping for thirst. With this unrelenting supply, Patton did not just have enough fuel to move, he had enough to accelerate. The African-American drivers of the Red Ball Express witnessed it firsthand. They had supplied the fuel that turned German predictions of an impending stalemate into a cruel joke. Patton's offensive speed multiplied exponentially, his armored divisions surging forward with unprecedented ferocity, outpacing the Germans' ability to respond. German intelligence reports, initially laced with disdain for American logistics, now began to reflect confusion and panic. German officers captured on the battlefield confessed they could not fathom how the Americans could sustain such an attack pace. They had been taught that modern war was a constant struggle against logistical limits, but the Americans had rewritten those rules. The confidence of the Nazis crumbled not just from tactical devastation, but from a profound psychological shock. German generals had mocked America's inexperience, believing a democratic army could not muster the discipline or preparation for total war. But what they saw was a deadly combination of unprecedented industrial capacity, logistical ingenuity, and the indomitable will of American soldiers. Their mocking laughter died not only from tactical defeat, but from the realization that they faced a civilization capable of redefining war itself. The initial laughter of the German high command had long since curdled into a bitter, acrid silence. Maps in the Wehrmacht headquarters, once marked with confident lines of defense and counterattack, now showed an incomprehensible reality. Patton's spearheads, supposedly stalled, were not just moving, but accelerating. Reports flooded in, not of bogged-down convoys, but of endless streams of trucks, ferrying supplies at speeds and volumes that defied every German logistical doctrine. For Field Marshal Walter Model, the Lion of Defense and a man celebrated for his tactical genius, this wasn't just a military setback. It was an unnerving, almost existential puzzle. He looked at the situation with a growing sense of despair, articulating a chilling realization. They were no longer simply fighting an army,
but rather confronting what he described as a superior civilization, an industrial behemoth fundamentally capable of redefining the very nature of modern warfare. It was a staggering admission from one of Germany's most hardened commanders, acknowledging that the American advantage wasn't merely tactical prowess or brave soldiers, but an inherent, overwhelming capacity to produce, distribute, and innovate on a scale unimaginable to the Reich. In a desperate, often theatrical attempt to inject chaos into the Allied rear and perhaps unravel this relentless supply chain, the Germans conceived of Operation Griff during the Battle of the Bulge. The plan was audacious. German commandos, fluent in English and clad in captured American uniforms, would drive seized Allied vehicles through enemy lines, disrupting communications, changing road signs, and sowing confusion. On paper, it sounded like a clever, if morally dubious gambit. In reality, it was a stark, almost pathetic failure that only underscored the profound chasm between German and American industrial might and organizational philosophy. Operation Griff's inherent flaw wasn't just the scarcity of English-speaking Germans or the limited number of usable captured jeeps and trucks. It was a fundamental mismatch of scale and mindset. Germany, its factories battered by Allied bombing and its resources dwindling, simply couldn't replicate the sheer volume of equipment, the seamless flow of fuel, or the improvisational adaptability that characterized the Red Ball Express. Their meticulous precision and rigid hierarchical command, while potent in specific contexts, were utterly antithetical to the decentralized mass production ethos that fueled the American war machine. The Americans could lose hundreds of trucks and have them replaced within days. The Germans, struggling to produce even the most basic components, viewed every vehicle as an irreplaceable asset. Griff was a desperate echo of a bygone era of warfare, a stark contrast to the continuous, almost organic logistical artery that was the Red Ball Express and the inexhaustible industrial heart that beat behind it. We've marveled at the sheer scale, the logistical genius, the industrial might that fueled Patton's lightning advance. But behind every ton of fuel, every crate of ammunition, every vital spare part delivered were men, thousands of them. And for these men, the Red Ball Express was not just a marvel, it was a grinder of bodies and souls, a crucible where heroism was forged daily, and where the very ideals of a nation were put to the ultimate test. The drivers of the Red Ball Express operated on the very edge of human endurance. Their schedule was relentless, a 24-hour-a-day, 7-day-a-week grind under constant pressure. Sleep deprivation was a way of life, with drivers often snatching mere minutes of rest wherever they could, slumped over steering wheels or in the cramped cabs of their trucks. The dangers were omnipresent, not just the lurking threat of German snipers or strafing runs, but the treacherous roads, the overloaded vehicles, and the sheer fatigue that turned every mile into a test of survival. Accidents were frequent and often catastrophic. In the short 82 days of its primary operation, hundreds of drivers were wounded and dozens paid the ultimate price, their names etched into the somber roll of honor, often far from the direct battle lines, but no less victims of war. The psychological toll was immeasurable. The constant tension, the isolation of long hauls through enemy-held territory, the awareness that their every movement was critical to the war effort, all combined to create an unyielding burden on their minds and spirits.
Yet, amidst this brutal reality, individual acts of courage and unwavering dedication shone through. Consider men like Sergeant Johnny Houston, who, when his convoy was ambushed, not only held off the enemy with his personal weapon, but then, despite being wounded, ensured his vital cargo of ammunition reached the front lines. Or Corporal James Washington, who, after his truck broke down under fire, single-handedly repaired it in the open, pushing through his fear to complete his mission. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the embodiment of the Red Ball spirit. These were the men, predominantly African American, who faced not only the horrors of combat, but also the indignity of segregation within their own military. It is here, in the unwavering resolve of these African American soldiers, that the Red Ball Express delivered a blow far more profound than mere logistics. Nazi Germany had built its monstrous ideology on the myth of racial superiority, dismissing non-Aryan peoples as inherently inferior, incapable of complex thought or courageous action. Yet it was these very men, deemed inferior by Hitler's regime, who were now the indispensable backbone of the Allied war machine. Every gallon of fuel they delivered, every bullet they transported, was a direct refutation of Nazi dogma. The German High Command, bewildered by the relentless American supply lines, could not reconcile what they saw with their twisted worldview. Their racial theories crumbled under the weight of American industrial output, yes, but more importantly, under the sheer undeniable competence and bravery of Black American soldiers who defied every racist stereotype. Their extraordinary performance in Europe became a powerful, undeniable argument for equality back home. These men fought for freedom abroad, only to return to a nation where their own freedoms were curtailed by Jim Crow laws and systemic prejudice. But their service, their sacrifices, and their undeniable contribution to victory could no longer be ignored. The Double V campaign, calling for victory against fascism abroad and victory against racism at home, gained immense momentum. Veterans of the Red Ball Express, having stared down death and overcome impossible odds for their country, were not content to accept second-class citizenship. Their experiences, shared and amplified, fueled the burgeoning civil rights movement, laying critical groundwork for the seismic shifts that would transform American society in the decades to follow. They drove not just supplies, but the very wheels of change, proving that courage and capability know no color, and that true strength lies in unity and justice. The laughter, once echoing through the war rooms of the Wehrmacht as they dismissed American logistical prowess, had long since died. By the autumn of 1944, the cold, stark reality of the Red Ball Express had settled over the German High Command like a shroud of dread. They had understood blitzkrieg, the swift, decisive strike, but they had never conceived of a foe capable of sustaining a blitz across an entire continent, not with sheer, unyielding industrial might. Intelligence reports, initially met with disbelief, painted a picture of an unending river of trucks, a logistical behemoth that defied every tenet of military theory taught at their academies. Captured officers, their faces etched with the fatigue of a losing war, spoke of the constant drone of engines, the relentless flow of supplies, and the baffling speed with which American forces could replace losses or reinforce positions. Field Marshal Walter Model, often called the Lion of Defense, a man known for his tactical brilliance and stubborn resistance, famously acknowledged the profound shift. He wasn't just facing an army, he was battling an entire civilization, one that had weaponized mass production and supply to an unfathomable degree. Another high-ranking German general, in a moment of candid despair, confessed the brutal truth that would forever encapsulate their defeat. "We were never prepared for your trucks." It was an admission that cut to the core of their tactical and strategic doctrines, recognizing that the very foundation of their industrial society was fundamentally outmatched by the Allied capacity for endless provision.
Amidst this dawning German realization, General George S. Patton Jr., a man whose rapid advances had been made possible by these very supply lines, understood the true debt owed. For all his fiery rhetoric and demanding persona, Patton held a deep, if sometimes unspoken, respect for the fighting man. He knew that the Red Ball Express, often driven by those facing prejudice even as they served, was the pulsating artery of his Third Army. He made it clear to his staff, and, through his actions, to the world, that without the relentless dedication of these drivers, his tanks would have been immobile hulks. Patton's tribute, while perhaps not always flowing with poetic eloquence, was heartfelt and direct. He acknowledged their courage, their sacrifice, and their indispensable role in turning the tide, recognizing that their grit and unwavering commitment were as crucial as any strategic maneuver. The Red Ball Express, having delivered nearly 500,000 tons of supplies, officially concluded its extraordinary run on November 16, 1944. By then, the port of Antwerp had been cleared, and ravaged rail lines were slowly being repaired, allowing for more traditional, if less spectacular, methods of supply to take over. Yet the Red Ball Express had done more than just move cargo. It had fundamentally redefined military logistics forever. Its revolutionary methods, the dedicated one-way routes, the 24/7 operational tempo, The rapid roadside repair teams and the sheer, overwhelming scale of its coordination became the blueprint for modern military supply chains. It proved that in the age of industrial warfare, logistics was not merely a supporting function, but a strategic weapon in its own right, capable of dictating the pace and outcome of entire campaigns. The Red Ball Express didn't just win battles, it rewrote the rules of how wars would be fought, demonstrating an unassailable truth. The ability to deliver is as critical as the ability to destroy. Its legacy endures, a testament to American ingenuity, industrial might, and the unyielding spirit of thousands of unsung heroes who drove the very wheels of victory. As the war concluded and the rumble of Red Ball trucks faded from the battlefields of Europe, the thousands of men who had driven them, many of them African American, returned home. They carried not just the scars of war, but an invaluable education in a field that would soon redefine modern commerce. These were the true pioneers of large-scale logistics, their crucible on the front lines forging unparalleled skills in supply chain management, expedited delivery, and inventory control that were utterly unprecedented. From the chaos of war, they emerged as an unexpected cadre of experts, many going on to establish or revolutionize trucking companies, warehousing operations, and distribution networks across America, unknowingly laying the groundwork for the intricate global supply chains we rely on today. Yet for decades, their heroic contributions remained largely unacknowledged, overshadowed by the prevailing racial prejudices of the era and the focus on combat narratives. The stories of the Red Ball Express, and especially the pivotal role played by its predominantly black drivers, were relegated to footnotes, if mentioned at all. It wasn't until much later, through the dedicated work of historians and the persistent voices of the veterans themselves, that the nation began to fully grasp the magnitude of their achievement. Commemorative stamps, documentaries, books, and museum exhibits slowly brought these unsung heroes into the light, finally giving credit where it was so profoundly due, recognizing the extraordinary courage and skill of men who battled both the enemy and systemic injustice.
The legacy of the Red Ball Express is a testament to a profound truth that continues to resonate. Logistics is not merely a supporting function, it is strategy itself. The ability to move men and material with unprecedented speed and volume didn't just enable Patton's Blitz, it fundamentally reshaped the nature of modern warfare. It proved that industrial capacity, when unleashed by human ingenuity and unyielding resolve, particularly the resolve of those who faced adversity on multiple fronts, could overcome even the most entrenched tactical brilliance. The laughter of the German generals, mocking America's perceived logistical ineptitude, had indeed died out, replaced by a grudging respect for a nation that could move mountains, quite literally, on the wheels of 1,000,000 trucks. These forgotten champions of the Red Ball Express didn't just win battles, they defined victory for a new era.